Why is it inappropriate to casually order fried chicken for black people? This traces back to the early 19th century in America. At that time, black slaves were nominally free, but the prerequisite was that they had to have enough money to buy their freedom. However, the white owners did not want to see their former slaves become equal to them. Therefore, they tried every possible way to prevent them from making money, prohibiting and restricting them from raising cattle, sheep, and other large livestock. This led to black people only being able to raise chickens, the cheapest type of poultry. To supplement the large amount of calories expended due to hard labor, they ate a lot of chicken. But today, cheap fried chicken is seen by racists as the best food for black people. Today I want to introduce one of the must-watch movies of your life, which is also adapted from a true story. This is not only an excellent work against racism, but also inspires countless viewers who have watched it with the courage to face life's evils and change themselves. The main character is named Tony, a security guard at a nightclub, or in other words, a bouncer with a knack for handling things skillfully. He resolves all troubles for the nightclub until one day the nightclub had to temporarily close for repairs, leaving him unemployed. As the sole breadwinner in his family, Tony had to find a way to make money. He even participated in an eating contest to win $50, competing against the biggest eater in town. Returning home, he proudly told his wife that he spent $50 on a hot dog eating contest, and the other person ate 24 like a monster. His wife asked, "Are you crazy, losing $50? Tony responded that he ate 26. The next morning, upon waking, Tony saw a black repairman in their home using their family's cup. As soon as his wife saw the worker off, he threw the cup into the trash. Yes, he was racist towards black people. Unexpectedly, an old friend called to offer a job, saying that a certain doctor was hiring a driver. Without much thought, Tony dressed up formally and went for the interview. He was taken to a luxurious room, but the person in front of him was a black man. Yes, this was the boss he was about to interview with. This immediately disappointed Tony. The man got straight to the point. His name was John, a pianist. He was about to tour the South, where racial discrimination was the most severe. Therefore, to protect his life and avoid unnecessary trouble, he wanted to hire a bodyguard and driver. After reviewing Tony's records, John felt he was the most suitable candidate, as he was skilled and handled things deftly. However, Tony felt very uncomfortable with the idea of having a black boss. But out of respect for his old friend, he decided to propose a sky-high salary to make John give up. Unexpectedly, early the next morning, John called to agree to Tony's terms, $120 a week, equivalent to his previous monthly salary, and the job was simply to drive John to performance venues as scheduled. Tony was overjoyed. Before departing, John's company paid Tony half the wages in advance and gave him a green book. At that time, many black people in America relied on the content of this book to avoid unnecessary trouble. In other words, without this book, black people could barely inch forward. Tony's wife saw him off, asking him to return before Christmas, and so these two strangers began a mysterious tour. Just as they set off, John told Tony two mandatory things he must do for him. Firstly, the piano he played must be a Steinway, and secondly, every evening a bottle of Cutty Sark must be prepared for him. Tony sat in the front having breakfast prepared by his wife while smoking. Being naturally talkative, he couldn't stop chattering. John endured it for a long time before finally asking him to stop smoking. "Please extinguish your cigarette. Why can't I breathe?" Tony replied, "What are you saying? I'm smoking the smoke into my lungs." Along the way, Tony stopped the car to use the restroom, not forgetting to take his wallet from the car, which left John inside the vehicle very angry. That evening, they arrived at their first stop. Tony accidentally discovered members of John's band flirting with girls downstairs, while John could only sit alone on the balcony drinking a bottle of Cutty Sark in solitude. Before the performance the next day, John spoke with Tony and gave him some advice. "After the performance, we'll often attend some parties and events. Pay attention to your way of speaking. It's full of elegant high society people." Unexpectedly, Tony replied, "I don't care about them. They can choose to listen or not. Must I use formal speech for you, the boss? Why make it difficult for me?" John replied, "Because you can do better than that." The performance started quickly. Through the host's introduction, Tony finally understood why this black pianist was invited to tour. John first performed on stage at the age of 2, and at 18 he was invited by conductor Arthur Fiedler to perform with the Boston Pops Orchestra in his first concert. He held a doctorate in music psychology and religion. He had performed twice at the White House in the past 14 months. He was truly a master of the arts. John passionately played the piano with beautiful melodies that amazed everyone present. Tony genuinely felt John's extraordinary talent. However, shortly afterward, he found himself kneeling on the floor, busy gambling with other waiters. John saw this scene, and after his performance called Tony over and said, "If you need money, come to me." Winning is more fun, but what if you lose? I've never lost playing cards and dice. Tony reflected on these words, realizing their truth. Kneeling on the floor makes you a winner. What about me? Everyone is playing just because they have no choice, but you do. In the evening, they returned to their accommodation. In a letter to his wife, aside from the usual inquiries, Tony mentioned John for the first time. He said that watching John play made him completely forget he was a black man and affirmed that he was a genius. However, he did not understand why, even with fame and money, John always seemed unhappy. The next day, the two continued their journey. Passing a rest stop, Tony was attracted to beautiful small stones in a store. He considered buying one for his wife, but abandoned the idea upon seeing the price. However, looking down, he noticed a stone on the ground. Instinctively, he picked it up and put it in his pocket. Naturally, this action was accidentally seen by one of John's band members. When John learned about this, he asked Tony to return the stone. But Tony argued, saying he picked up the stone from the ground, so why should he return it? John seriously stated, "If you don't return it, we won't continue." Reluctantly, Tony finally complied. Not long after they arrived at the next stop of the performance, Tony checked the piano at the venue as per John's usual request. But upon arrival, he was met with a shabby piano filled with trash. He approached staff on site to inquire about the situation. According to the performance contract, they were supposed to provide a Steinway piano, but the staff member indifferently said, "Why clean it? This piano is good enough for that black guy to play." Consequently, in the very next moment, Tony slapped him straight across the face without a word. The performance then began. Watching John on stage, Tony stood beside him joyfully like a child. Perhaps he was not even aware that John had gradually entered his heart. In the letters to his wife, stories about John increasingly filled the pages. On the way to the third stop, they passed by a fried chicken store. Tony immediately bought a large bucket and began eating heartily in the car. He then offered a chicken drumstick to John in the backseat. "It's really delicious, but I don't want to dirty my carpet. My mother wouldn't allow me to dirty the carpet," John said. Tony persuaded him for a long time until John finally used his fingers to carefully pick up the drumstick and took a cautious bite of fried chicken for the first time in his life. He was then captivated by the crispy taste of fried chicken. "What about the bones?" Tony opened the window and threw them out. John smiled and did the same, tossing the bones out the window. But immediately afterward, Tony threw the cup outside as well. Seeing this, John asked Tony to go back and pick it up because the bones could be eaten by animals or decompose naturally, whereas the cup would only pollute the environment. In the evening, they arrived in Kentucky. The farther south they went, the more severe racial discrimination became. The two could only stay in separate hotels. John stayed in a small rundown inn. As usual, he sat alone drinking whiskey. However, wearing a formal suit, he looked out of place among the other black individuals around. A black man nearby wanted to invite him to play ball. To avoid awkwardness, John lied, saying he was going to meet friends. Not long after, there was an urgent knock on Tony's door. It was the band members who said that John was in trouble. The two immediately ran there. They arrived at a bar and saw John drunk and being beaten by a group of white men. Tony then spoke up and demanded they stop, but the group relied on their numbers to provoke and even pulled out a knife to threaten. Seeing this, Tony slowly reached behind him as if to pull out a gun. Eventually, he managed to get John out of there. Outside, Tony seriously told John that from now on he had to be accompanied wherever he went because the road ahead would become increasingly dangerous. Like a wounded child, John obediently agreed. The next day, the performance proceeded as usual and received warm applause. But shortly after leaving, the car broke down. Tony got out to make repairs, and John also stepped out to breathe some fresh air. But when they returned, they saw black workers laboring hard under the scorching sun. Suddenly, the workers stopped and collectively looked at John. John's expression reflected deep thought. Although they were all black, they had two completely different destinies, which made John feel very uncomfortable. At the fourth stop before the performance, John wanted to use the restroom but was stopped by the butler. He pointed to the makeshift restroom outside and said, "That's where you can use it." John flatly refused, saying he would rather go back to the hotel. On the way back, Tony, not understanding, asked why not just use any place along the road. John said he had his pride. After the performance, he still politely shook hands with everyone. Tony whispered to the musicians in the band, "If it were me, I would have slipped away already." At this point, another musician stepped in, saying John could enjoy the admiration of thousands in the north and receive much higher fees here, but he still chose to tour in the south. His purpose is to break the prejudices and discrimination of white people against black people. These words immediately changed Tony's perspective about John. The next day, Tony wrote a letter to his wife. John stood by and observed the naive words and spelling errors akin to those of an elementary student and quickly took a look. Indeed, Tony's letter resembled a meticulous record only detailing the daily tasks and meals. John couldn't bear it any longer and said, "Let me help you. Dear Dolores, thinking of you brings to mind the beautiful flat fields of Iowa. The distance between us makes me constantly yearn for you. Without you, my time and experiences become meaningless." Afterward, they reached their fifth stop. On the way, they passed by a clothing store. John was suddenly captivated by a suit in the display window. The two of them entered intending to try on the clothes, but the shop owner pulled them back and said that black people were not allowed to try on clothes. John just smiled and quietly left. Tony saw everything but couldn't do anything. That evening during the performance, John poured all his anger into the music, finding release in that way. Later that night, as Tony was preparing to go to sleep, the phone rang. On the other end, John said he was in trouble. Arriving at the scene, Tony witnessed an unbelievable sight. The police were about to arrest John and the other men. Tony used money to bribe them to release John. But as soon as they were outside, John turned cold. He not only didn't thank Tony but also reproached him for bribing the police. The two then had a big argument ending in discontent. The next day they arrived at the sixth stop. Tony happened to meet two friends who were also Italian. They saw John next to Tony and began to tease him in Italian, saying that if he wanted to make money he should come to them. "Why work for this black man?" Tony simply said, "See you in the evening," without further comment. However, he did not realize that John actually understood Italian. As Tony was about to head downstairs, he found John standing at the door speaking seriously. "I hope you won't go. I don't want to lose this friend. I will promote and give you a raise immediately." But Tony flatly refused. In that moment, John seemed like a helpless child. Tony then said, "What I mean is we agreed on $120 a week plus expenses. We agreed on that, right? I'm not going anywhere. I'm just going downstairs to tell them about this." At this point, John felt incredibly guilty towards Tony and sincerely apologized for the previous night's incident. Tony responded, "Don't worry. I've worked in nightclubs all my life. I know this world is very complex." That's right, the world is very complex, but how many people are willing to accept its complexities when they truly encounter it? The next day, the two continued their tour. While waiting at an intersection, a nearby girl looked at them incredulously and then called her boyfriend over to see a white man was driving for a black man. At that time in the southern United States, this was completely unheard of. But as they were still astonished, Tony gave a confident universal gesture. They went on to complete their seventh performance. On the way back that evening, they encountered a torrential rainstorm. Suddenly, a police car stopped them. Tony got out of the car and the officer told him this place is called Sunset and the rule here is that after sundown black people aren't allowed to stay. When the officer saw John in the car, he immediately changed his demeanor and demanded John step out for a search, stating that he was half black. This ignited Tony's anger. Both were then taken to the police station. John repeatedly insisted on his right to call his lawyer. Eventually, the officer allowed him to make a call. However, not long after, a call came in from the local governor, who was the brother of the then president of the United States. Tony was shocked too. Once outside, Tony was very excited, thinking this was the kind of story one could brag about for a lifetime. However, John remained angry and humiliated. The two argued again. Tony said that each day he worked hard to earn a living for his family, while John lived like a white king in a lofty castle. "Compared to you, I'm more like a black man," Tony said. At this moment, John suddenly realized that in Tony's eyes, black people were always the lower class. This realization immediately devastated John, who walked straight out of the car into the pouring rain. Tony chased after him, asking, "Where are you going?" John replied, "Yes, I live in a castle, Tony. It's me the rich white people invite to play the piano to show they're cultured. But as soon as I finish playing and step off the stage, one become the black man they despise. Discriminating against me is what they truly want, and I have to endure it all alone. I'm not accepted by my own people nor by white people. I'm not even considered a man. Tony, tell me, what am I?" Tony wanted to say something to comfort him, but the words wouldn't come out. Finally, they reached the last stop of their tour. The manager very politely assigned John a cluttered storage room behind the kitchen as his dressing room. Tony and the other musicians from the band enjoyed dinner at the restaurant. However, after changing clothes, John was informed that black people were not allowed to dine in the restaurant. This time, John decided not to tolerate it any longer. "Unless I am allowed to eat here, there will be no performance tonight." According to the contract, if any performance was not completed, Tony would not receive the remaining payment. The manager did not take John's words seriously and called Tony aside, offering money to resolve the situation. "You think you can buy me off? Please don't insult me. If not for the money, you wouldn't be working for a black man, right?" Stop, Tony. John knew how much the remaining payment meant to Tony, so this time he left the decision to perform up to Tony. If you agree, then I'll perform. But in the next moment, Tony firmly led John away from there. They then found a small bar filled with black patrons. Under the curious gazes of those around them, they enjoyed a hearty meal. Encouraged by Tony, John stepped onto the stage, sat before an old piano, and began to play an impromptu piece. This was the first time he performed for his own people. The audience began to dance joyfully to the music. John also smiled genuinely, as if he hadn't relaxed like this in a long time, as though he had rediscovered his true self. After leaving the bar so Tony could keep his promise to his wife, John decided to head back to New York immediately. However, on the way the snow began to fall heavily. John joked that Tony could bring out the stone he had taken and it might help them reach safely. It turned out John had known for a long time that Tony never actually returned the stone. "Thank you. Now I feel much more assured." But they hadn't traveled far when they were stopped by the police again. This time, however, it was a friendly reminder. With this warmth, the two finally made it back to New York on Christmas Eve. After getting out of the car, Tony invited John to his home, but John politely declined. Returning to his house, John let his butler leave to celebrate Christmas while he stayed alone in the big empty house. Staring at the lucky stone in his hand, he felt lonely. Elsewhere, Tony's family was joyfully gathered for Christmas Eve dinner. When they asked how he felt working for that black man, Tony seriously said, "Don't call him that." His wife was surprised by Tony's reaction. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Tony hurried to open it, and there was John holding a bottle of wine standing awkwardly. Tony walked over, embraced him, and invited him inside. He introduced John to his family in a dignified manner. "This is my best friend, Dr. John Shirley." Happy New Year! The film won 5 Oscars, including Best Picture at the 91st Academy Awards. It is not just a story about friendship transcending racial barriers, but also a powerful indictment against racial discrimination. Through the journey of Tony and John, we see change and acceptance, as well as the value of family and kinship. No matter how complex the world is, humanity and understanding can always triumph. The movie is truly excellent, so I still recommend everyone to watch the original film. Today's story ends here. Thank you all for watching. What do you think about this movie? Please comment below.